Welcome back for another book review. Today we are talking about this one. So this is Queer Magic, LGBT plus Spirituality and Culture from Around the World. I don't know how to say this author's name. It looks like Tomas, might be pronounced differently, Prower. So briefly, this book is a history of the LGBT, no plus, LGBT history and a little bit of the present current world, but a lot of this tends to have a more historical analysis. Now I'm gonna mention this here because it should have been in this book. It should have been really big, really apparent, big flashy, big page, really catch your attention. It needed some trigger warnings. Now, if you're new to my channel, you won't know this, but I typically do not require trigger warnings for a lot of books. It's like, whatever. Some books need them. And this is one that I feel like actually legitimately needed it in the conversation. Because typically, when we pick up a witchcraft book, like, we're not expecting to have very graphic details and like things that are, which I know, if you're new to witchcraft, that's gonna feel weird. But typically when we come to Wicca and witchcraft and modern paganism, we don't need trigger warnings. This book actually legitimately needed one. Actually, a few. It needed a lot. It was really, I was feeling very uncomfy, and I haven't experienced these things, but I would assume people who have gone through this, if I'm feeling very uncomfy, and I'm usually not, like, again, I'm not a trigger warning kind of a person typically, I am just warning you, if you are sensitive on a few specific things, we'll get there in just a sec, you will not probably want to pick up this book. Now the thing is, the queer community, the LGBTQIA plus community, typically they're going to have a lot more trauma. It's just the facts of life. Like, it's not heavily accepted in most parts of the world. You just deal with a lot more. And so, inevitably, it is for that community that you want to be a little more sensitive, a little bit more gentle, and this book is not that. So the specific trigger warnings that I would say for this book, which again, I normally don't have to have a segment for, but here we are, trigger warnings would include very descriptive and very heavily mentioned constantly rape. So if you were sexually assaulted in any capacity, it probably is going to trigger you. He goes through it a lot. Also very descriptive hate crimes, very detailed. There's also just a lot of general violence towards the queer community, so do keep that in mind if it's gonna bother you. And then lastly, there was one in particular that really truly disgusted me to the point that I'm kind of questioning why Llewellyn allowed this to be published, especially without a trigger warning of any kind, because that's not what you're expecting from this publishing house. It's not something you're going into these books expecting, but it was an extremely graphic, violent mutilation that he goes into, I feel like, way too much detail for the particular audience that this book is aimed for. All that to say, can you guess what my rating's gonna be? 2. Is it burnable? No. There's still worse books. But I really don't like this book. And I can acknowledge that it might be helpful for some people, but truly I didn't like this book, and it left me quite disgusted, to be honest, when I finished it, because of, as I mentioned just briefly, specifically the mutilation part, and I think it was in part 6, or yeah, part 6 or whatever. He has it segmented out. But there's one section, if you've read this book, you know what I'm talking about, I'm sure. But that one just left me with this ick that I was already feeling from this book, because again, I don't love very detailed rape scenes. I don't like very detailed hate crimes, especially when I'm reading a witchcraft book. That's not what I'm here for. Like, and again, without trigger warning, without setting it up of like, hey, we're gonna talk about this, FYI. Like, there's ways to handle that conversation. It just left me feeling not great about this conversation. Other people have handled it really well. I was left very uncomfortable, very disgusted by this book. So another reason for the low rating outside of all of the trigger warnings is that this wasn't really a queer book. And if we're using queer as the umbrella for this conversation instead of the letters, because really, if we look at this, the title here where it says LGBT+, the plus, just ignore that first of all. The T is kind of mentioned. Also does use a slur in here a couple times, so prepare for that. That could have also been a trigger warning, actually. The B is decently mentioned, but mostly from like the gay men perspective of like a bisexual man experience. little teensy bit of women, but not really. Non-binary, bye. And the L is just briefly mentioned, and then most of it is the G. So if you are a gay man and you want to learn about your history, 99% of this book is for you. There is a little bit of a discussion about that. A lot of this did not have great reviews when I was looking through it, and I was like, oh, what have I gotten into? But a lot of people talked about this, that he really emphasizes cis gay men. That is what this book is written for. It is all about you guys. There are brief mentions for lesbians, but really it's for gay men. And I know that he mentions it very briefly at the beginning, that there's not a lot for lesbians, but I feel like at that point when you were researching this book, you should have just changed the title and just excluded it, or just have it as like a toss out of like, hey, by the way, also these guys, because it really, there was so little for it. It just was like randomly brought up just a smidge here and there, but for the most part, it was about a gay man experience. And if that's what you're wanting, that's great. Market it a little bit differently, which is kind of the intended audience for this book. I feel like if you're looking for some queer or LGBTQIA+ content for kind of a historical analysis, a little bit of modern, it's also not pagan, really. It's mostly the world. So FYI, if you're looking at this for paganism, modern witchcraft, Wicca, not really. This is going around the globe and going with like, there was like also random like judgments. Like, he really didn't love the Vikings. First of all, he had some issue, which for as researched as he is, you would think he wouldn't call them the Vikings, because that was a job title, not the people, from what I have gathered. So actually it's normally called the Norse people. And then the Celts are just a giant lump, instead of, you know, the differentiating between like the Irish and the Welsh and all of that, but whatever. So mostly you have like, just, it was like, it started off with like Judaism, Islam, Christianity, and then you also have like Eastern things of like Hindu and like Tao and Confucianism. I know I say it wrong, I'm sorry, but like different parts of the world, which is fine, but at the same time, like, I'm coming to Llewellyn for pagan books, not this. Just, it didn't feel like a great fit. It's a good concept, but it just, so anyways, if you are looking for queer history across the world, LGBTQI, well really, let's just be perfectly honest, not the letters. If you're looking for gay, specifically in the context of gay men, history with a sprinkle of other people, history, this book. Would I buy this? Can you guess what the answer is? Cause no, I'm happy to be gone with this book and get it out of my life forever. Which, by the way, was the most common consensus. There was a lot of DNFs for this book. So for some other thoughts on this book, I just decided, instead of picking random points, I would just, after I finished parts of the book, so part 1, part 2, part 3, so on and so forth, I would just summarize what I was thinking about, how I was feeling after each one. So we'll just talk about it kind of briefly here. So the first part of this book, I was just left going, this isn't what I wanted. This is not what I thought I was picking up. I thought queer magic was going to be about queer magic, about being in the LGBTQIA+ communities and having that emphasis as a modern witch, as a Wiccan, as a pagan, not the historical analysis that was really the heavy emphasis. And the book starts off with Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. Really not what I was here for. And also there was a lot of analysis on potentially gay people of the past. It's like the not confirmed, and again, like, if that's what you're wanting, fantastic. That's not what I thought this book was going to be about. And I was just kind of disappointed to start off with. Part 2, my big thing is I was really starting to question the like historical analysis of the book. How much research is there? At this point, I had looked at some of the other reviews and people were discrediting him left and right. So I was starting to be a little questioning on his things. Really, this wasn't the book that I wanted, and it was in this part 2 of the book, that he was using a slur. I checked across multiple sources for this to confirm it, but he does use a slur that is used against the trans community, and yet he only randomly uses it. It felt like, to me, he didn't know how to reword his sentence to not use that word. And if you don't know what the word is, it's a different word for trans that I believe it's used in Rocky Horror Picture Show, but we don't say that word, really. From what I can gather from all of the queer spaces that I entered to go find out and confirm, it is in fact considered a slur. So, we don't say that word. We say trans. Just trans, that's easy. Boom, done. Transgender, boom, easy. Super easy to say. And he couldn't manage to say transgenderism. Or reword the sentence to not need the ism of the word. Just reword that sentence. It's really easy to do. Super easy. I don't know why he didn't. And it just felt weird for trying to present yourself as like part of the queer community and trying to do this book and trying to be these things, but then actively using a slur. Didn't love that. Also, this book is just written like an essay. As the reader, he's not really including you in the conversation much. There is the call-outs, but I just felt like I was reading a long essay. So by section 3, I was getting really done with this book. This is when I was really like, okay, we need some trigger warnings in this book. It was making me pretty uncomfortable. It was pretty graphic with some rape scenes that I was feeling uncomfortable from. I cannot imagine, well, I kind of can't imagine, but not to the extent of somebody who had been sexually assaulted to have to read these scenes without knowing that it's there. If you know and you're prepared, it's fine. But if you're not expecting that and that's something you've had done to you, like that's gonna really mess you up, more likely than not, to just randomly have a very graphic scene mentioned. I just didn't love it. Also, his portrayal of the Vikings, he literally was like calling them macho, and it just, you could tell he had a serious bias against the Vikings, and I didn't love that. And he was just very judgmental, but also had like this weird soft spot kind of for like some of the Christian things in comparison to the Vikings, and I'm like, really? And also, wouldn't it be called the Norse? You know, but whatever. Like at that point, I could understand why people were DNFing around this point in the book, because if you look on Goodreads, there's a lot of people who kind of mentioned where they had DNF'd this book, did not finish, because obviously. So by part 4, I was really like, where is the trigger warning? This is getting extremely graphic. He kind of almost was like not discrediting how horrible pedophilia is, which is like, that's really hard to do apparently, because he was like, well, it has some bonuses, and you're like, I'm sorry, what? What? And he means it in the context of the older men training the younger men on how to be a man, and I'm like, you don't have to compare that to pedophilia. Because that's what he was talking about. Being like, well, you could take some parts of it, and I'm like, let's not though, that's really bad. Along with rape and sex work and very derogatory terms with this, it's just not handled very elegantly. It's very in your face. There's a lot of hate crimes in this one in particular, and I just didn't want to keep reading at that point. Also, it was fun to mention at this point, I realized that like asexuals, just fuck off. This was not your book. Like at all. He really only focused on the 4 letters, barely, really, again, really just the G in LGBT. Also, he was calling Buddha sexy, and other people commented on that too, and I'm like, why? Absolutely why? I just, again, this book was a mess. So in part 5 is when I started to question how the lesbian community in particular would be feeling about this book. Because the trans people, I've already kind of covered. You got your slur early on, so it's not gonna like go up from there. And at this point, I was really questioning how it would be for a lesbian to read this book. From what I could gather, the use of, and he always quoted it, topping and bottoming, he always emphasizes it in the male-centric version. It's never from the like lesbian side. And I couldn't really find an answer one way or the other, but from the lesbians I have experienced, they don't use those terms. They hate when you say, well, who's the man and who's the woman? Who's the top? Who's the bottom? That's not, in my experience with the lesbians I have encountered and what I could find online, it's not very common. And like, you kind of can use it, but it's more of like a descriptor. But even then, at this point, this whole book was really feeling just very male-centric as a whole. And I was just like, couldn't we just like not... It was really sexual, basically, this entire book. By part 6, again, this was the mutilation scene that really fucked me up. Like, this scene was so graphic, and I just was stuck hours after reading this book, wondering how the actual fuck the people didn't die. Because, like, the way it's described is going to, not going graphically, it's gonna involve a lot of pain, a lot of blood. How is it supposed to heal? How is it supposed to work afterwards? Like, biologically, how is that supposed to work? And especially, how are you not going to die from infection? Like, I'm just left sitting there going, how? And I didn't want to find out because it's absolutely disgusting and horrible and like, why, Llewellyn, did you include this? I'm judging you super hard for allowing such a graphic description of mutilation to be included. So the last part was, my note is literally like, I guess I'm glad there's a conclusion. I'm just glad to be done with the book because this was awful. I truly hated this book. I am disgusted by the writing. I had hoped that somebody in the queer community, in the LGBT, because of course why would we have the other letters, community, would have handled this better. Would have handled it with a lot more care in bringing up such graphic content, of such triggering content. Because, again, it's not like they're not traumatized. Pretty much every letter has some issues. And so, like, it depends on where you are in the world, but still, handle it with care. And handle it with some grace and be like, hey, if this is gonna bother you, skip to this section. Simple. But you also just didn't need to go into such detail and constantly have such triggering topics. And again, I'm not usually one to care about that, but it really bothered me for this one in particular because I don't come to my books expecting to have to be like, well, guys, guess what? Here's the trigger warning list. We don't normally have to do that over here. So to have that was a lot. I hated this book. I was not the only one who hated it. There's plenty of other reviews that dismantle it for various reasons. There's a lot of reasons to not like this book, but those were my main ones. So I would love to know your thoughts, and if you have a better book on the topic, please let me know because this one was not great. So anyways, until next time, thank you for following along for this chaos of a video. Huge thank you to my patrons. If you want to support me and get access to exclusive content, it is patreon.com/nightlilacrafts. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. I post every single day. And until next time, thank you so much for watching, and blessed be.